Is this the best Discworld novel? Penguin Modern Classics think so. I'm Jack, this is Red Book Joy, and I want to talk to you about Night Watch by Sir Terry Pratchett, which is due to be published as a Penguin Modern Classic on the 28th of April 2025. If you've not been to my channel before, you may not know, but I am a huge fan of Terry Pratchett and the Discworld books, and I have read almost all of them. There are two that I am putting off reading because they're the last two I have yet to read, and since he died 10 years ago I have put off reading the final Discworld novel and the ones that I had left yet to read. So yeah, it's been a bit of a slow process. I had about 5 books left to read when he died. They published posthumously The Shepherd's Crown, which is the final Discworld novel, and I have yet to read that and one other. So I've been slowly working my way through the ones that I hadn't yet read, because it is taking me a lot of emotional energy to read them. But I will get to them at some point. Every year I say, this year I'm going to finish reading the Discworld series, and I don't, because I just feel once I've read that final book, it will just be a bit too much for me emotionally. But that's how much I love this series. So when I saw that Penguin were releasing a modern classic of Night Watch, it gave me a lot of thoughts and feelings, which I'm going to discuss with you here. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about the book Night Watch. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the Discworld series if you don't know much about it, but just a very brief overview because I do have another video on that. And I'm going to talk to you about this particular edition and why it means quite a lot to his fans, to his estate, and why it's a little bit bittersweet. But also I'm going to talk about the fact that I don't think Night Watch is necessarily the only book that should be on the Penguin Modern Classics library. So I'm going to recommend some books that I think could stand alongside it. I'm also going to list any articles, videos, books that I read from in the description box below. So if you want to find out more, you can go and look in the description box and find out all the extra information that you would like. So the announcement on the terrypratchett.com website says the Penguin Classics series includes the best of world literature across genres, countries and centuries. Terry Pratchett joins a long and illustrious line of literature's greats, a hugely welcome acknowledgement of the brilliance of Sir Terry's literary canon. The editor from Penguin had this to say. So this is the editorial director of Penguin Press. It is an unmitigated joy to be able to publish Sir Terry Pratchett as one of the most influential British writers of the 20th and 21st centuries. As a Penguin Modern Classic, I am thrilled to be able to celebrate his literary achievements and the immensely high esteem he is held in by readers and other writers with this edition of Night Watch, his finest novel. Rob Wilkins, who's the managing director of Terry Pratchett's literary estate, had to say that it's a gratifying experience to see Terry's greatest Discworld novel take its well-deserved seat among other classic titles of the modern age. For so long, Terry worked against a backdrop of snobbery uniquely targeted at genre writers. It's heartening to see him once again recognised as the great wordsmith, commentator and thinker that he was. It's actually quite bittersweet that 10 years after his death, he's finally being accused of literature, which I think I'm going to put on the thumbnail because it's a really classic Terry Pratchett quote. Occasionally he's accused of literature, but he did face over the years a lot of backlash and genre snobbery, and being accused of being someone who writes pot boilers, being called a complete amateur at one point, and I'll get on to all the people that said these things. But he also has been highly complimented by a lot of writers who think he is wonderful. A.S. Byatt called him a master storyteller. Kate Atkinson said he was the author that made her laugh more than any other. So what a lot of lovely compliments to get. So Night Watch as a book, let's get into that. Night Watch is the 29th Discworld novel, so you'd be forgiven for wondering why they're publishing this and not one of the earlier novels. The Discworld can technically be read, any book can be read as a standalone, technically. There are sequences that do run chronologically, but they're not connected in terms of the stories. I think the City Watch sequence really is connected because certain characters, particularly the main character Sam Vimes, who is the commander of the City Watch, he undergoes such a huge character arc and such an evolution as a character that it is worth following his story from the beginning. And out of all of the sequences in the Discworld books, I used to have a different sequence as my favourite, but since rereading these, this is my favourite sequence of all, and Sam Vimes is one of my favourite characters. I wouldn't say he's my favourite because they're just tied, and every time I think of a favourite, I just kind of, they swap around a bit. So If you want to know where to start with the Discworld, I've got a whole video on it which gives a little rough rundown of what it is, but really they're satirical looks at humanity through a fantasy lens. So Terry Pratchett examines the darker sides of humanity, the good sides of humanity, the institutions that we have here through a fantasy kind of humorous lens, but serious messages, serious commentary going on as well. This is the 6th book in the City Watch sequence. In it, Vimes is commander of the City Watch and they are chasing down a serial killer, a murderer. He is struck by lightning and sent back in time to 20 years before, where the city is a very different place. He meets his younger self and he kind of adopts this other persona and takes him under his wing and teaches him how to be a policeman and a detective. And it's about more than that though. Vimes, at the start of the book, he is the successful middle-aged man, and he is living a very different life from the working class roots that he came from. And so he is taken back to that time when the city was a much different place, where it was politically run by, and it feels so very relevant now, but it is run by a paranoid oligarch who is questioning people, who is shutting down people who speak out against him, and a revolution happens. So I think it's quite a timely book to be out at the moment. But yeah, it's a story of political power, socialism, and the way we treat others, and nostalgia, and the what ifs in life. What if we'd have taken this path or that path? It's also just a very tightly plotted and fast-paced police procedural where they try and catch a serial killer. So that's Night Watch in a nutshell, and it's also very, very funny. So as well as getting a sensible black and white new cover, this new edition has a foreword by Rob Wilkins and an introduction and annotations by Dr. David Lloyd and Dr. Darryl Jones, contextualising the novel and Terry Pratchett's far-reaching legacy for new readers and current fans alike. I couldn't find much out about Dr. David Lloyd, but Dr. Darryl Jones is the Professor of Modern British Literature and Culture at Trinity College, Dublin, where Terry Pratchett has an honorary doctorate. I'm really looking forward to reading all these new notes and things about a book that I love, but also I just wonder what Terry Pratchett himself would have made of it all, because he really wasn't very happy at school when he was younger, and he didn't go to university. He went to become a reporter at the age of 17 on a local newspaper because he knew he wanted to be a writer. So I'm going to read a couple of things from Terry Pratchett, A Life with Footnotes by Rob Wilkins. One of these quotes I think I've also seen in A Slip of the Keyboard, which is the collected non-fiction of Terry Pratchett. When he was younger, he went to school and he didn't get on at school. So he was from Beaconsfield in Buckinghamshire, and he went to this tiny school, and in the school they decided at the age of 6 which children were worthy of going on to do the 11 plus exam. And the 11 plus exam in the UK, if you're not familiar with it, it still goes on in this country today. It sorts children into those that can go to the grammar schools, which is the more prestigious academic types of schools, and those that would go to the secondary moderns or technical colleges, the more vocational, less academic, less illustrious schools. And at the age of 6, instead of teaching all of the children in the same way, their head teacher, who sounds like a horrific person, sorted all the children, said, well, they don't need to teach those to the 11 plus standard, they're never going to make it. And Terry Pratchett was lumped into that category, but his mum would not have it. His mum decided that she would take it upon herself, get him a tutor and teach him as much as she could herself to pass the 11 plus. And he did, and he went to grammar school. But from that point on, he was never a fan of educational institutions. He never felt at home there. And then he was asked to write something for the anniversary of the school that he went to. And so he wrote back to them and he said this. He was asked in 2011 to contribute a few words for the school's 60th anniversary celebrations. Terry gamely obliged, but chose not to gild it too thickly. In all truth, I cannot say that my memories of Holtspur School were of the warmest, he wrote. He then equally gamely took the blame upon himself. But possibly that was entirely because I was an absolutely quintessential example of a twit and a dreamer. It says, I don't think he believed for one moment that the fault was truly his. It was a lifelong position of Terry's that schools would be far better places if they took special care to look out for and nurture the twits and the dreamers, which I couldn't agree with more. So he went on to grammar school and decided that when he fell in love with books and reading, which is a whole other really fascinating story, because he didn't enjoy reading when he started and his mum used to have to pay him to read and then he read The Wind in the Willows. So he basically fell in love with books and reading and story writing, and he wanted to be a writer. And he left school. Instead of going on to do university, he went to become a reporter. There's a bit in his biography about that, why he didn't go to university. And it says, what never seems to have been discussed was the possibility of Terry finishing his A-levels, and they're the exams that you take in the UK if you want to go to university, and going on to university to do a degree. There was no precedent for that in the Pratchett family because he came from a very working class background. There was no precedent for that in the Pratchett family, and no feeling either that it was a course of action with much to recommend it. A-levels, at least, marked definitively the distinction between blue-collar opportunities and white-collar opportunities, so they were something worth aspiring to in terms of getting on. But tertiary education was surely just wasting your time and everybody else's, a step too far. And the truth is that Terry himself, at this point in his life, would not entirely have disagreed. I don't believe that university would have been for me, he wrote in the notes towards his autobiography, adding his sense that it would have rolled over the top of me somehow. On the other hand, he went on, the University of Local Journalism offered travel, sometimes all the way to Speen, which was another local town, the acquisition of a number of questionable tricks of the trade, education in the nature of humanity, and a window onto the commonality of mankind in all its facets. So he didn't go to university, and he didn't have a huge amount of respect for the education institutions that he'd been part of. And then when he became more successful, he then got up to, I think it was like 10 honorary doctorates. So yeah, I just wonder what he would have made of having one of his books analysed and annotated by some sort of illustrious literary professor. I just really do wonder what he would have made of all of it. I think he would have been very, very pleased, actually. It's also very gratifying to hear him being praised, because there have been a number of quite famous scathing reviews of him over the years, and I'll put links to those in the description box, but you can go and watch one which was the late review where a poet, I think his name's Tom, I can't remember the poet's name, I remember Terry Pratchett's name, don't remember his name, but he called him a complete amateur and said that, you know, his books don't even have chapters, which most of them don't. Later on he started adding chapters to some of them. Oh, and I did hear something really funny. It was on a Reddit forum, so I don't know how true it is, but I must look at my books and see if it is true. But some of his later books then said a quote on, you know, the reviews bit, complete amateur, doesn't even have chapters, which if he did do that, and if his publishers did that and put those up on the front of his books, well, all power to them, which is hilarious. After he died, a couple of months after he died, and there was a lot of, you know, sort of remembrances for Terry Pratchett and commemorating him, and there was an article in The Guardian by someone called Jonathan Jones, I think his name was. The headline is, "Get Real, Terry Pratchett is not a literary genius. Life is too short to waste on ordinary pot boilers. And our obsession with mediocre writers is a very disturbing cultural phenomenon." And this writer, who then admits he's never read a Discworld book, goes on to call Terry Pratchett mediocre. There was a sort of response article to it, which just basically says that his books are the opposite of pot boilers. They've got moral weight to them, and that Jonathan Jones, if that was his name, yes, he basically needs to go and read one of them, which he has since done. And whilst he admitted that it wasn't a bad book, it's not literary enough for him. However, they're not literary books, and they're not pretending to be literary. They are good stories which make you think, with moral weight to them. Good and funny, imaginative, and his worlds that he's created, and the characters feel so real. The other one that really is amazing when you read it is one where he's being interviewed and asked about why he writes fantasy. And at this stage, he is the best-selling author in the UK, because he was only knocked off of that spot by J.K. Rowling when the Harry Potter books took off. And he's the best-selling author in the UK. Now, this journalist says, "You're quite a writer. You've a gift for language, you're a deft hand at plotting, and your books seem to have an enormous amount of attention to detail put into them. You're so good, you could write anything. Why write fantasy?" which is just so rude. And he says, I had a decent lunch and I'm feeling quite amiable. That's why you're still alive. I think you'll have to explain to me why you've asked that question. So he says it's a rather ghettoised genre, he puts it to Terry Pratchett. I've done 20 books in my series, and since the 4th book, every one has been in the top 10 national bestsellers, either as a hardcover or paperback, and quite often as both. 12 or 13 have been number 1. I've done 6 juveniles. All of those have nevertheless crossed over to the adult bestseller list. On one occasion, I had the adult bestseller list, the paperback bestseller in a different title, and a 3rd book on the juvenile bestseller list. Now tell me again, this is a ghettoised genre. So he's really, really successful at this point. And this person is still insistent on saying that fantasy, it's not serious. Why are you writing anything else but fantasy? And the interviewer says it's certainly regarded as less than serious fiction. So Terry Pratchett has a big sigh, which is listed in this interview. And then he goes on to talk about the fact that fantasy is the root of all literature. He said the first fiction, without a shadow of a doubt, the first fiction ever recounted was fantasy. Guys sitting around the campfire telling each other stories about the gods who made lightning and stuff like that. They did not tell one another literary stories. They did not complain about the difficulties of male menopause while being a junior lecturer on some Midwestern college campus. Fantasy is without a shadow of a doubt the literature, the spring from which all other literature has flown. He goes on to say more. I will leave that link in the description box. Go and read it, because it's a great answer to what I think is a really insulting question. It just shows you the snobbery that fantasy was looked down upon with, and still is to an extent. And so, onto the books that I would recommend to Penguin's editorial editor as Discworld novels that could stand alongside Nightwatch. I'm not going to mention some of my absolute favourite Discworld books. These are some of the older ones. Equal Rights, Mort, Guards, Weird Sisters. These books are some of the oldest Discworld novels and ones I think you should start with if you're new to Discworld and you really want to get into it. But I'm not recommending these, though I think they could go on there. I'm not going to recommend every Discworld book I love, because then that would kind of negate the point of the video. So these books, I'm going to recommend them as books that could go on the Penguin Modern Classics library with Nightwatch. It's because I think they're very, very clever. They're well plotted, and they're when Terry Pratchett has really got into his writing stride. Guards though, love that book so very much. So this isn't necessarily all the books I love in the Discworld. These are the ones that I think for your consideration. This is Going Postal. This is the first book in the series about this character, Moist von Lipwig, who has a great name, and he is a con artist, and he is going to be hung and he's given a reprieve if he will revive the ailing post office within Ankh-Morpork, which is the main city on the disc. There's a lot going on in here about capitalism, about big industry and taking on smaller institutions. There's all sorts of things going on in here. So yeah, Going Postal, very, very good. Small Gods is one of the standalone Discworld novels, and I think quite possibly the cleverest Discworld novel. It is about religion and is set in the kingdom of Omnia. They worship the great god Om, and they are extremely religious zealots. And within the kingdom of Omnia, there is a young acolyte called Brother, and he is working in the garden of the temple that he to Om that he is assigned to as an acolyte, and he's one of the lowest of the low, and he's a true believer, and he comes across a tortoise in the garden, and the tortoise is actually the great god Om, because on the disc the gods are real and their physical form and the power that they have is influenced by the people who believe in them. And as it turns out, even though Omnia is full of like religious zealots who run the country, that Brother is actually the only person who really believes in the great god Om. So this is a commentary on organised religion and about belief, and yeah, it's very, very good. Hogfather by Terry Pratchett, just wonderful. Discworld does Christmas. Hogswatch is the Christmas midwinter festival on the disc, and the Hogfather is their Father Christmas, and so he gets kidnapped and Death has to take his place and deliver all the presents on Hogswatch Eve. It's very, very funny, very touching as well, because there are some scenes in it where he has to go and visit extremely poor people. It's just a wonderful, wonderful story. The Truth is the 25th Discworld novel, and it's all about the disc's first newspaper. So it's all about journalism and truth, and it's all by an ex-journalist, Terry Pratchett. So yeah, a lot of really good things to think about in here, especially in our post-truth era. Monstrous Regiment is one of the other standalone Discworld books that I didn't read until later. I've only read it once and I really loved it. It's about a war that's been going on for hundreds of years between two very small countries on the disc, and it's called Monstrous Regiment because one of the countries is kind of like a Transylvania type country and there are werewolves and vampires, and so the regiment is made up of characters like that. But also one of them happens to be a girl who is undercover going to look for her brother who has gone missing in action. So it's about war, about gender, about a lot of things that are really interesting but also extremely funny, though I don't think by this stage I have to tell you that the Discworld books are hilariously funny, because they are. So if you are a Discworld fan, do you agree with my choices? If you're not a Discworld fan but you're thinking of getting into it, have I persuaded you to read any of the books? Let me know in the comments below if there are any that you would add to the list, if there are any you're interested in reading. If you would like any of the books that I've mentioned, if you want a 5% discount, I have a discount code for the online books retailer Books Please. If you buy anything from them, I get a percentage at no extra cost to you, and it helps me run the channel. It's a very tiny percentage, but every little bit helps. And if you've never been here before and you think you might like to subscribe and come back for more of this rambling nonsense, then please hit the subscribe button and hopefully I will see you again here soon. Bye.